The Russian Black Sea Fleet was supposed to be untouchable. It was the crown jewel of Russian naval power in the south, the symbol of Moscow's dominance over an entire sea, the operational backbone of every Russian military ambition from Syria to the Bosphorus. And Ukraine, a country without a single operational warship of its own, just destroyed it. Not metaphorically, not partially. The flagship is at the bottom of the Black Sea. The fleet's headquarters has been struck multiple times. Vessel after vessel has been hit, damaged, or sunk. And the ships that remain have been forced to retreat so far from their home base that they can barely function as a coherent fighting force anymore. But here is the question that every military analyst is now asking behind closed doors. How did a navy that does not exist defeat a navy that does? The answer to that question is one of the most remarkable military stories of the 21st century. And it starts with a peninsula that Russia thought it had turned into an impenetrable fortress. When Russia seized Crimea in 2014, it did not just take a piece of land, it took what it believed was the ultimate strategic asset in the Black Sea region, a natural aircraft carrier jutting into the sea. A peninsula surrounded by water on three sides, a location that had housed the Russian Black Sea Fleet for over 2 centuries, since the time of Catherine the Great. Moscow immediately began transforming Crimea into the most heavily fortified position in the region. Anti-aircraft systems were deployed across the peninsula, radar networks were expanded, underground fuel storage, ammunition depots, and command infrastructure were hardened. The Kerch Bridge, a 19-kilometer structure connecting Crimea to mainland Russia, was built at enormous cost to ensure a permanent logistical lifeline. In Moscow's strategic vision, Crimea was not just occupied territory, it was a power projection platform. A base from which Russian naval and air assets could threaten the entire northern Black Sea coast, intimidate NATO's eastern flank, and support military operations across multiple theaters. The Kremlin believed it had built something permanent, something unassailable. What most people do not realize is that in building that fortress, Russia also built a trap, and Ukraine spent years figuring out exactly how to close it. The transformation began quietly, long before the full-scale invasion of February 2022. Ukraine understood from the moment Crimea was taken that it could never match Russia conventionally in that theater. It could not build a fleet fast enough. It could not project air power over a peninsula defended by some of Russia's most advanced air defense systems. A direct military confrontation in Crimea would be suicide. So Ukraine did something that military strategists will study for generations. It decided not to fight the war Russia was prepared for. Instead of building conventional naval power, Ukraine invested in asymmetric capability, drone technology, precision strike systems, naval drones, which are essentially unmanned surface vessels packed with explosives and guided remotely over hundreds of kilometers of open water. When the full-scale invasion began, the world was watching tank columns and artillery exchanges on land. Almost nobody was paying attention to what Ukraine was quietly developing and deploying at sea. But what happened next changed everything. The first major signal came in April 2022. The Moskva, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, was struck by 2 Ukrainian Neptune anti-ship missiles and sank. It was a vessel displacing 12,000 tons, a guided missile cruiser that had served as the command ship for Black Sea naval operations for decades, gone in a single engagement. The psychological impact was enormous, but the strategic implications were even larger. Russia's Black Sea Fleet suddenly understood that Ukrainian anti-ship missiles could reach them, that the sea was not the safe operating environment it had been assumed to be. That distance from Ukrainian shores no longer equaled safety, but Russia still had Sevastopol, still had its fortified home port, still had the fleet infrastructure that had been built up over years of post-2014 investment. And then Ukraine started going after that too. The attacks on Sevastopol began escalating in a way that forced Russian commanders into decisions they had never anticipated making. Ukrainian maritime drones began appearing in the harbor, sea-skimming unmanned vessels, guided by satellite navigation and remote operators sitting hundreds of kilometers away, began threading through Russian naval defenses and striking vessels docked at their own home base. This is where the story takes a serious turn. A navy's home port is supposed to be its sanctuary. It is where ships return to rearm, refuel, and repair. It is where crews rest. It is where the command structure operates. Sevastopol had been Russia's naval sanctuary for over 2 centuries. Ukraine turned it into a target. Strike after strike began degrading the infrastructure that the Black Sea Fleet depended on. The fleet headquarters building in Sevastopol was struck in a precision attack that killed senior officers and disrupted command operations. Fuel storage facilities were hit, submarine pens were targeted. The dry dock used for major vessel repairs was damaged in strikes that left Russia without the ability to properly service its own ships inside Crimea. The cumulative effect was devastating. But it was not just the physical damage that mattered. It was what the damage forced Russia to do next. Faced with an increasingly untenable security situation in Sevastopol, Russia began relocating its Black Sea Fleet assets eastward. Ships were moved to Novorossiysk, a port on the Russian mainland far from Crimea. On the surface, this looked like a sensible precaution. Move the fleet away from the threat, protect the assets. But what most people do not realize is what that relocation actually meant in operational terms. Novorossiysk is not Sevastopol. It does not have the same infrastructure. It does not have the deep water berthing capacity, the repair facilities, or the logistical support network that Sevastopol was built to provide. Moving the fleet to Novorossiysk was not a tactical adjustment. It was an admission that Russia had lost control of the security environment in its own flagship naval base, and it came with a cost that keeps compounding. Operating from Novorossiysk, the Black Sea Fleet is now positioned further from the western Black Sea, further from the critical sea lanes that connect to the Turkish Straits, and further from the operational areas where it was supposed to project Russian power. Every mission now requires more fuel, more time, and more exposure during transit. But the range problem is only part of what has crippled the fleet. Ukraine's long-range strike capability kept expanding. Crimea itself, which was supposed to be the logistical backbone supporting Russian military operations across southern Ukraine, became progressively harder to supply and harder to defend. The Kerch Bridge, that massive symbol of Russian permanence in Crimea, was struck twice. First in October 2022, then again in July 2023. Each attack damaged the structure, disrupted supply lines, and humiliated the Kremlin's narrative of Crimea as an inviolable Russian possession. The psychological impact of watching the Kerch Bridge burn on live television, transmitted globally within minutes, cannot be overstated. This was not just infrastructure. This was the physical manifestation of Russia's claim to Crimea. Striking it was a message written in fire, and the message was this: nothing in Crimea is safe, nothing is beyond reach, and the sanctuary you built is no longer yours. However, this is where things take a serious turn in terms of what the fleet's degradation actually means for the broader war. The Black Sea Fleet was not just a collection of warships. It was Russia's primary tool for projecting maritime power in the southern theater. It had conducted the cruise missile strikes on Ukrainian cities that had terrorized civilian populations since the early days of the full-scale invasion. It had maintained the blockade of Ukrainian ports that prevented grain exports and contributed to a global food crisis affecting hundreds of millions of people. As the fleet was degraded and pushed back, something remarkable happened. Ukraine reopened its Black Sea shipping corridor. Without Russian naval dominance to enforce the blockade, Ukrainian grain shipments began moving again, not through diplomatic agreement, not through negotiation. Through the simple fact that Russian warships could no longer safely operate in the western Black Sea without risking destruction, a country with no navy had broken a naval blockade. That is not a metaphor. That is an operational reality that rewrote the rules of what small nations can achieve against larger ones when technology and strategy align correctly. The weapons that made all of this possible deserve a moment of serious attention because they represent something genuinely new in the history of warfare. Ukraine's naval drones, the domestically developed Magura and Sea Baby systems, are not sophisticated in the way that modern warships are sophisticated. They do not have advanced radar systems or defensive countermeasures or crew quarters. They are essentially fiberglass hulls, electric motors, navigation systems, and explosive payloads. But they work in darkness. They work in silence. They are difficult to detect on radar because they sit so low in the water. They can be launched from improvised locations along the Ukrainian coast or from positions near Crimea. They cost a fraction of the ships they destroy. And they have now sunk or severely damaged vessels worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The cost-exchange ratio alone is catastrophic for Russia. Every time a naval drone worth perhaps a few $100,000 destroys or disables a warship worth tens or hundreds of millions, Russia loses not just the asset, but the time, the resources, and the industrial capacity required to replace it. And Russia cannot replace them quickly. The sanctions regime, the loss of access to Western components, and the strain of financing a full-scale land war simultaneously have compressed Russia's shipbuilding capacity severely. What Ukraine understood intuitively and proved operationally is that in the modern era, naval dominance is no longer exclusively a function of how many warships you have. It is a function of how effectively you can deny your enemy the ability to use theirs. The Crimean trap is now fully closed. The peninsula that Russia fortified as a power projection platform has become a liability. Its supply lines are interdicted. Its port facilities are damaged. Its air defenses, while still formidable, are being steadily degraded by long-range strikes. The military infrastructure that was built at enormous cost between 2014 and 2022 is systematically being taken apart. Russian forces in Crimea are now in the position of a garrison under siege rather than a force projecting outward. Every resupply run carries risk, every ship movement is tracked, every significant military asset on the peninsula is a potential target. And in Moscow, the leadership that promised its population that Crimea was Russian forever, that the Black Sea was a Russian lake, that the fleet was the permanent symbol of southern dominance, is now watching that narrative collapse in real time. The fleet that was supposed to be untouchable has lost its flagship, its headquarters, its dry dock, and its home port security. It has been pushed back to a mainland base it was never designed to operate from. It has been denied control of sea lanes it was built to dominate. And it was done by a country that started this fight without a single warship. The larger lesson here is not just about Ukraine and Russia. It is about the nature of military power in the 21st century and how fundamentally that nature has changed. For centuries, naval power meant ships. More ships, bigger ships, better armed ships. The nation with the largest fleet controlled the sea. That logic governed naval strategy from the age of sail through both world wars and into the Cold War. Ukraine just demonstrated that this logic has been overtaken by technology. Precision strike weapons, autonomous systems, drone swarms, and the ability to contest an adversary's maritime environment without ever building a conventional fleet have introduced a new equation into naval warfare, one that the world's largest navies are now scrambling to understand and adapt to. Because if Ukraine can do this to Russia's Black Sea fleet with improvised systems built under wartime conditions, the implications for every major naval power on Earth are profound. The Black Sea is now a warning, not just to Russia, to every military that has built its doctrine around the assumption that conventional naval superiority guarantees maritime control. That assumption is now permanently broken. Crimea was supposed to be Russia's greatest strategic achievement in a generation. The prize that justified everything, the fortress that could never fall. Instead, it became the place where Russia's naval power went to die. Slowly, systematically, and without the enemy ever needing to set foot on its shores. The fleet is stranded, the fortress is crumbling, and the trap that Ukraine built patiently and invisibly over years of preparation is holding tighter with every passing month. The Black Sea will never look the same again.